This is a CBC podcast.
Good afternoon. I'm Rita Chelly. This is Ontario Today.
Overnight, a worst-case scenario for the White House. A little before 1 a.m., President Trump tweeted, "Tonight, the First Lady and I tested positive for COVID-19. We will begin our quarantine and recovery process immediately. We will get through this together."
In this hour, the U.S. President has COVID-19. Why does it matter? 1-888-817-8995. There are, of course, the obvious reasons.
I wear masks when needed. When needed, I wear a mask. I don't wear a mask like him. Every time you see him, he's got a mask. He could be speaking 200 feet away from it. He shows up with the biggest mask I've ever seen.
The U.S. President has a track record of trying to minimize the danger.
Looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. I hope that's true.
Well, I think, Bob, really, to be honest with you...
Sure, I want you to
I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes,
because I don't want to create a panic.
The U.S. President not wanting to create panic, but also revealing on tape way back in February that he knew, that he understood that the virus is an extreme threat.
It goes through air. That's always tougher than the touch. But the air, you just breathe the air. That's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus.
Donald Trump, his wife, a trusted aide, all testing positive for the coronavirus, all in self-isolation. It is a major development, and it matters for a ton of different reasons. The U.S. is a blink away from its election. Trump is a world leader. He is a flashpoint of volatility. How sick he becomes, how or if he recovers, the kind of medical help he gets, who else is infected, the maskless rallies, all of it matters. And like everything these days, many people will argue and fight about what it means. It's worth remembering that 2 Canadian federal leaders have just emerged from quarantine. They were locked down in their own homes because they got COVID-19. The cases are surging here in the U.S., around the world. The pandemic trouble never left, and this virus is once again spreading too fast. The U.S. President tests positive for COVID-19. Why it matters to you. 1-888-817-8995.
Yesterday's modeling data was a wake-up call. We could have 1,000 cases a day by mid-month. So again, I have to keep saying, please don't let your guard down.
The whole health system is in crisis right now. This pandemic is putting pressure on everything from public health through the testing system, through the hospital, through long-term care. So you shouldn't be going to a restaurant unless it's with people from your household. When you get to the testing system, it's almost broken right now. Our COVID situation is the level is too high to handle.
That is the Medical Officer of Health for Ottawa, Dr. Vera Etches, just a few hours ago this morning during an interview, almost begging people to stay apart, wear masks. You're also reported here on CBC that Doug Ford's cabinet is considering creating red zones, of which Ottawa would certainly qualify. So, it's about them over there on the other side of the border, but also about us. The U.S. president right now facing the biggest health threat to a president in a generation. He obviously can't campaign the same way while in isolation, and depending on what happens, he may or may not even end up on the ballot. I realize there are a lot of what-ifs about this, but we're putting it to you about why it matters. I could ask it a million different ways, right? Was it a question of if or when? 1-888-817-8995. I think I was going to go to Tanya. I think she just dipped off the line there. I'm going to get the number again. 1-888-817-8995. We have a couple of guests with us throughout the hour. In this first half hour, Dr. Raywat Deonandan. He's an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to you.
Thank you for having me.
So, actually, before we start, because I was thinking U.S. remains one of the top hotspots in the world, do you know where it's still ranking in terms of COVID cases?
I don't know off the top of my head, but top 3 for sure. I think India is our current leader, but the USA is not that far behind.
Right. I had that written down, but I thought I should ask you, okay, in your gut, what is it about this development? What is significant?
My first reaction is that, what's the saying, karma is a female canine. So we have an individual who's been actively advocating for us to diminish our guard against COVID-19, and he ends up getting infected. And 2020 keeps on giving, never ceases to amaze us. It's troubling at a number of levels. For the president's personal health, he's in all the high-risk groups, right? So his prognosis is probably good. I mean, I'm not a doctor, I can't diagnose him, but based upon the epidemiology, the risk factors are higher in his group, but the odds are still with him. But the messaging is interesting here. Someone who is actively eschewing all these safety protocols, who is saying this is not that transmissible, gets the disease, despite the fact that most people around him are trying to protect it.
Mm-hmm. You know what? I have lots to add to that, but I think we should just go to the callers and we talk because it's a big one. We had a different show planned. I should acknowledge it was very lighthearted, and so we decided we'll do that on another day. We really didn't want to act like we were somehow on another planet. Tanya, you're in Mississauga. This news that the U.S. president has tested positive along with his wife and a trusted aide. What are you thinking? I mean, why does it matter to you?
Okay, so as I told your producer, I just found out about 20 minutes ago from my neighbor. I had no idea. But the first thing is that I thought is I don't want to go on Instagram or Facebook because all his naysayers are going to be like, well, I hope he dies, and that just messes me up, the concept of that, about somebody thinking that about somebody else. It doesn't matter how they feel about them. That bothers me. But my major thought that came to my head right away is if he has only mild symptoms, he has been downplaying this for the longest time. If he has only mild symptoms, what will his narrative be at that point? What will he be saying that the present anti-maskers or his followers, his devoted followers, what will they be thinking after that? Well, you know what? I don't really have to wear a mask. He made it through all right. But this virus is so much more than that. It could be a 1,000 people that have no issues with it, and suddenly there is one person that it's given to that has made all the done all their checks and balances, and it's given to that will kill them or destroy their life forever. So what will his narrative be if his symptoms are mild?
Let me ask you, what do you think? Let's talk about this. So one way, and I'm going to use the word because somebody will, and they have on Twitter, he's like the poster boy now for being a COVIDiot, but you don't want to go there. You're going the other way and saying, if he's not even very sick, how do you think he's going to come out? Like if he's not, they're saying right now it's mild symptoms. What do you imagine that he'll come out and say? Will he be humble or defiant?
I honestly, his track record, I pray that he was humble, honestly. But his track record speaks the exact opposite way. I have this horrible feeling in me that he will come out and he will be speaking about the fact, or give the hint. This isn't his thing. He gives a hint and people jump. I feel that if he gives the hint that this is not as serious or not as bad, even the hint will speak a very, very, very loud word to a lot of people that are misguided right now. Let's that's what my major...
I hear you, Tanya. There's a lot to go. Do you want to jump in here? Are you talking to our guest, Raywat Deonandan? Yeah.
I agree with Tanya. What concerns me most is I think Mr. Trump will be fine. He has the best care in the world. And I think what will happen is this narrative when he recovers will be that this is not a big deal, right? This can go any number of ways. And until it gets worse for him, as it might, but let's hope it doesn't, because we're all human beings here. We want the best for everybody. Until it gets worse for him, the narrative will continue to be that this is not that serious because, look, a man in his 70s who is frankly obese and probably has some other comorbidities doesn't seem to be suffering that much. So why should I be afraid?
Well, on the other hand, I mean, it really can go a lot. If, let's say, again, there's a lot of ifs, which aren't great for journalists, but let's say everyone's thinking this way. If he dies even, I mean, there is a constituency that might think that he was being deprived of the best care, that it was, a plot to do him in. Like, it could go in so many wild directions, right? And that is destabilizing. So it seems like any scenario, because it's him, is actually destabilizing because he's the leader of such an influential country.
Yeah, I mean, we can't predict what's going to happen here. It could go in any number of ways. And you're right, we cannot predict the narrative. It can be shaped in any number of ways depending upon the motivations of the political class. And I'm just a small-time scientist. I can't control that aspect of it. What I can tell you is that given his demographics, being over 70, he has about a 5% chance of dying, and his obesity makes it a much higher risk. He has a high risk of ventilation and hospitalization, but he has presumably the best care in the world. Now, what I'm wondering is, will he be given hydroxychloroquine, right? The drug he's been touting all this time as being the miracle drug that most scientists think will not do anything. So there is so much that might happen here.
Let's go to Ellis in Ottawa. This news that the U.S. president has tested positive, why does it matter to you? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me. I guess I, to put it bluntly, I just fear the worst case scenario. I'll preface it by saying that I wouldn't wish ill on anybody, up to and including obviously the President of the United States. But if he passes away and the Democrats win by a small margin, I feel like some of the fears that I've heard voiced from Trump supporters may come true, up to and including violence. And I'm just concerned about that. So I very much hope that he gets well soon.
Well, let's think about this. If he went off the ballot, it may actually improve the chances for the Republicans in some ways, if people feel like they're voting for Mike Pence and not Donald Trump.
I can't say that I know if that's the case. I know that Trump has a lot of support in the United States, and I think that in that case, if he's taken off the ballot or if he passes away, I think that the right is going to make somewhat of a martyr of him. And instead of there being any sort of justice, either if he loses or in the second term, I think that the right is going to propagate this image of Trump, that he was a success and, due to unforeseen circumstances, he's not president anymore. And I worry that some of his hard supporters, and up to, including some of these radical right-wing groups, take that too far. And so I wish him well.
We're going to talk actually with a political scientist who's based in Detroit in the next half hour, so we'll get maybe more into that. But it's fair comment, Ellis. I mean, it's a very high-stakes situation, whether you look at what you're describing, you're looking at the markets as they open. Jerry, you're next in Aurora. This news about the U.S. president, where'd you hear it? Did you know last night? Because there was some suspense around what was going on, and then he tweeted out the news, the official news at 1 a.m.
Well, I heard it first thing this morning. I was up early, about 5:15 or so, and heard it about 6 o'clock. So,
what was your reaction? Was it, it finally happened, or what was your first reaction?
My first, without being too emphatic about it, my first thing was yelling, "Great!" It's long overdue.
You're being careful, but you were listen, you have to be honest, because there were people who were delighted. They thought this is the just desserts, right? And it sounds like maybe that was the kind of reaction you were having.
Yeah, I was extremely delighted. I just wish it had happened about 6 months ago. And to be honest, I'm one who I think is echoing probably the opinion of several million people on this planet, that I hope this finishes him off.
It's quite a statement, eh?
Well, he's done so much damage that I don't think the U.S. can ever fully recover from, bordering on possible civil war. He has polarized the U.S. more than it ever has been. and I think he deserves whatever comes to him.
What about the other consequences? The caller before you, who, no fan, let's say, of Donald Trump, but he would see his death, let's say, as a major disaster. That there would be, if it looks like the U.S. is on fire now, it would just explode.
Well, I think it is due to explode with or without him. But I think it would be a touch of an improvement if it were without him.
Jerry, I'm just curious.
I figure he's the worst thing that has pretty much has happened to the USA. And I've studied quite a bit of its history.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you might have been around for a while, too. If you've seen politics, I don't know. It's hard to judge how severe this kind of thing. Have you ever thought that about anybody else? The better that to just have them finished off.
No, you're putting me on the spot.
Well, you called a radio show.
I hated Winston Churchill with a passion in my younger years. To me, he was a hopeless warmonger, and everybody practically revered the man. And Trump is in a similar position because he's got quite a few million Americans that worship him and will, swear by him being the greatest of the 45 presidents ever.
Okay, Jerry, I got to say, now you left me confused because of all the figures to pick from the Second World War, because you had others, like maybe Mussolini even at your disposal, that you picked Winston Churchill. Good grief. Longer conversations with you at some point. But listen, thank you for your call. Raywat Deonandan, what are you thinking as you hear these last couple of callers?
Well, I'm thinking how much this pandemic has revealed the divisions in our society, whether it's socioeconomics, political, and so forth. It's really uncovered, who we are as people and what our limits are, what our tolerances are. It's fascinating. But, bringing it back to the epidemiology, I find fascinating about the whole Trump infection issue is how he was not protected. We're always under the assumption that his people around him are being tested all the time, that maybe he's not wearing a mask, but everybody else around him would be. So how did he become infected? How did that happen? And the lesson is always, oh my goodness, how infectious is this disease? How much we have to be vigilant. They're
apparently testing every day. But, we should put this on the record for people. It is becoming clear that his confidant knew that she was COVID positive and traveled with the president on Air Force One to Minnesota on Wednesday. So she was feeling sick and then quarantined on the return flight. She got off on the back of the plane, and then the next day on Thursday had that positive diagnosis. There was no announcement from the White House. In fact, the White House press secretary, who was also on the plane, held a briefing with reporters, never mentioned it, not wearing a mask, because this is something that, a lot of his team did, obviously in deference to what he said. It was only after Bloomberg News reported it Thursday about this staff person, then Mr. Trump, the president, confirming it on a show on Fox News that he was being tested and waiting for his own results. John, you're calling us from Ottawa. This COVID positive test, the president making it clear that he did, in fact, then was positive at 1 o'clock in the morning. Why does it matter to you?
It matters to me for a lot of reasons, but I don't believe him. I think it's a political ploy. I think it's done to gain empathy. I think it's done to avoid more debates. I think it's done to perhaps avoid the election and delay the election. I think by faking this, I think he wins. He's desperate and he's looking for a rabbit hole out of the mess that he's created. So I'm not sure I believe it.
Okay, I'm just slumping my shoulders, and because I don't know what to say. I hear what you're saying, because anything, I guess, is sort of theoretically possible. But really, you don't think that. He's resisted this a long time. He's wanted to play it down. It's not going to hurt people. Mocks Joe Biden on stage the other night. It would be quite a thing to perpetuate.
I think he's starting to sense that he's backed into a corner, and he's a desperate man, and he's trying some desperate measures. And I don't, to the least, I don't put this past him and and his cohorts to make up a story like this. And, let's say he's made it up and then he comes out and says, I'm cured and all. Where do we have the proof? Do we see his tax? No, we don't. Do we see his tax returns? No, we don't. Everything about this man is false, in my opinion. And I think this could fall into that.
Okay, you know what? We're taking, it's a fair game. It's an open line show. One of the things I want to ask you before we let you go, because you're with us here for this first half hour, is maybe this idea, as a medical professional, when we get into this mode where nobody trusts anybody, even John, kind of the reverse not trusting, like thinking that it could be fake to buy him time or buy him sympathy. This idea sometimes that skeptics and deniers, even about the coronavirus, that they may find it just too frightening, too overwhelming to admit the scope of the danger, that there's something so profoundly existential about something like a global pandemic that it may be easier to try to laugh it off and mock the people who believe it. I wonder if you can just offer some reflections as a medical professional, because it matters. It's part of the whole pandemic story right now.
How we responded to this pandemic in terms of public health communication was insufficient, and no one foresaw the complications of, a rapidly communicating social media universe with active disinformation parties from various political circles. Nobody foresaw that would be an issue to deal with. And it reminds me of, they say that when the Europeans first arrived in New Zealand, some Maoris could not perceive the ships because it was so outside of their lived experience. Don't know if that's true or not, but that's the narrative. And that's kind of what you're talking about here. Something is so unacceptable to you and outside of your realm of reality, then you cannot accept it as reality. It's kind of like why the hatred for the mask bylaws. The easiest narrative is there is no emergency, therefore I should not adhere to these guidelines, rather than, maybe the emergency is not as severe as I first thought. My thoughts right now are how to combat misinformation, how to combat the disinformation. There is no obvious solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's really difficult, and whether people will choose to have a vaccine if we end up with one that is effective. I'm thinking back to some programs that I did, in fact, about talking to people about climate change and why they remain skeptical. And the fear in some of the voices. One woman who said, I'm too scared, actually, to accept that it could be true. I worry that I'm wrong by denying it, but I'm too scared to accept it. And I think for medical professionals, this puts them in difficult situations, that the balance between chastising people, encouraging them, and again, news today that, some red zones might even be declared in our own province. Thank you for making time with us at the last minute. I know you did. And I think we were hearing your baby in the background.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, don't apologize. That's kind of a nice little twinkle. How old is he or she?
4.5 months, the crying
Oh,
age.
Wonderful. So you're still, I hope, getting some sleep. All right, thank you for your time. We are going to have a political scientist join us in the next half hour. In the first half hour, it was Dr. Raywat Deonandan, who is an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. We are talking about the COVID positive test that President Trump has received. His